You're doing a marvelous thing here. I can't tell you how pleased I was that you selected me, the obscure poet of the Midwest, to be here. So thank you so very much. And thank you, Paul, for all you do to keep this thing going, for the, what do we call it? The August POPO Fest. It's a
Yeah,
great thing. It's done one marvelous things for our work.
well, we're gonna talk
Go
about
ahead.
we'll talk about that. That's exciting. Thank you for your kind words. I'm grateful for your inspired participation.
We'll see how inspired it is.
How many years have you been doing the fest, Daniel?
Is my audio coming through okay for you?
Yes, it is.
Very good.
How many years have you been doing the fest?
I started in 2014, and that resulted in a publication. I was invited to the fest by a woman in France who had participated earlier, and she said, "You really need to check this out."
Amanda Dowd.
Amanda Dowd, yes, fellow beekeeper. We have that in common, and we had communicated about bees and poetry and expatriatism and things like that. And she said, "You really need to check this guy out in Cascadia." And so I did, and here we are, some 4 years later, and I don't know, four or five publications later, and it's really strange how 30 days of spontaneous writing catapults me and takes these little seeds and makes them into much longer poems. I found it very good. I've been teaching writing, I guess, now since 1973, some at the college level early on, and then I got drummed out of academia. And so I've been working as a counselor in the trenches for about 29 years, doing that, working with schizophrenics and addicts and alcoholics and other mentally ill people. And I find that I use an exercise based on the 17 syllable sentences to help them describe in a very pithy way what's going on inside their head. And so these people who probably would never read poetry ever, and certainly not write any, they're struggling just to get along. They find a great deal of insight, and it's just a marvelous result that happens. They tap into their creativity, which is very latent. So it was a big boost in my first effort, and I probably did not do it the way it was prescribed to do as epistolary poems, but it all turned out okay. And midway through the month, Michael Brown was murdered here in St. Louis, in Ferguson, and Robin Williams died. And those two events became a pivotal event in these poems that I was writing, these little kernels. And it resulted in Amanda telling me, after I sent her the whole manuscript, she said, "You need to get this out." So it resulted in a publication of Spider Lace Dragonfly Mind, Sutra for August Insects. And it's a short book, but it's a nifty little book.
What attracted you to POPO in the first place? I know that you said your friend Amanda told you about it, but what did you think was appealing about the process of writing all these poems in a short amount of time?
I'm a great fan of Nabokov. I'm a great fan of Ferlinghetti, Ginsberg, Wallace Stevens, and the act of creativity. And I think that all poetry writing, in the end, is either self-referential and confessional, which I find to be cheapening what poetry is all about, or it's about the act of writing poetry. It is the best window into creativity that I've ever seen. So Wordsworth, Blake, all those people, you know, we started off with not even knowing the word ekphrastic, but seeing a visual aid and then writing about that seemed to be rather interesting. And I would get a postcard from somebody and I would look them up, believe it or not. I hesitate to confess this, but I'd look them up on Facebook or any other way. I'd look up the town they lived in, if nothing else. I'd get background information. And doing that little bit of research just pushed me into making the poem 3 lines, 4 lines, 12 lines, sending out back to that person a rather interesting and challenging, very challenging type of work. I've since let go of some of that. Last year, I was able to put together a sonata based on a musical form with 31 poems about a beekeeper and a sheep herder who fell in love at a distance on distant mountains. And I have to admit there were many times that I said, this is really failing. This is artifice. This is following a formula. But in the end, it seemed to work out pretty good. I think what attracted me at the beginning was you said, write a poem every day, be spontaneous about it, don't go back and revise. That has given me a great deal of freedom to be spontaneous in the writing and write it correctly the first time. You know, maybe it's in here for a while.
How does POPO augment your own poetry composition practice?
Realistically, Paul, all the credit I will give to you and all the blame to me. But I think that shot in the arm in August has given me a great many poems. It's the starting place for the year in my academic calendar, which I have not had for the past probably 20 years or so. I still teach, but I teach counselors how to be counselors now. So it's not a lot of poetry, but sometimes I'll do shamanic drumming and I'll tell them how to access their theta relaxation waves. And sometimes I'll teach them 17 syllables. And sometimes we'll just talk about haiku. I'm fascinated at the Heart Sutra, Ginsberg, haiku, and you know, these 17 syllables become so very important and pithy. So the fest gives me a deadline, a hard deadline. And admittedly, I don't write a poem every day. I probably write 2 or 3. And when I do that, I might throw all 3 of them back in the notebook and come back later. A couple of years ago, I started 3 or 4 lines, ended up 12, 15, not commemorating, but the subject matter was Chernobyl. And I picked it up in April at the anniversary of that particular nuclear disaster. And it has turned into a very long narrative poem about the people and a lot of research. And I would say that POPO lit my fire. I hadn't published anything since 1990. I figured I would die in obscurity. And actually, between you and me, I think I probably will. But, you know, somewhere out on Amazon and Create Space, there are a couple of books full of poetry and, you know, old PTSD, Vietnam veteran type stuff, you know, which I would thank my brothers and sisters for their service. I do think that your encouragement and the paradoxical looseness and tightness of, you know, writing an epistolary poem, it's a foundation of the creative process that I can remember from writing some of my first horribly adolescent poetry and when I was 14 and 15. Now I'm 68. I'm almost 69.
I'd like you to demonstrate or to take us through your method. Tell us how you sit down. You know, do you write out the address? Where do you get the card from? And, you know, other decisions that go in, including, if necessary, stamps and that whole thing. So take us through how you create a postcard poem.
I'm lucky that the post office is right next door to my office. And I will go next door and buy enough stamps for the entire time. And forgive me while I'm rummaging through something here. And very often, there will be just a response to someone else's postcard. I work with a notebook somewhat, but primarily I sit down at the keyboard on this very technological wonder that I'm talking through today, and the poem takes form. So I do, because my writing is so horrid, I can't even read it. I very often will just type the first draft. And that first draft is then printed, glued onto a postcard, or I'll run a 4x6 card through my printer and print it directly. One year, I printed all the poems that way, directly onto cardstock, flipped the cards over, and took a corresponding image. I have about 6,000 photographs that I can access, and very often I'll find something. I also wrote some of these poems after August, actually in preparation for the next year, when my youngest son was a cheesemaker up in Vermont. And so I spent some time at his farm and had some real quiet time. So some of the poems got polished during that time and grew into longer pieces. The actual Poetry Fest, I've been trying more regularly to write it a day and run it through the printer. And this last year, somehow my trusty printer ate a lot of postcard stock. So I ended up doing some handwriting, and that was different for me. And I appreciate some of the mail art that I've been getting and other people's handwriting. And they're as bad as mine.
Remind me what town in Missouri you live in.
I live just south of St. Louis, Missouri, in Jefferson County. I keep bees out here in the woods. I live in a log home, surrounded by 88 acres of woods on one side and 127 on the other side. And I'm at the end of the telephone, electric, and water line. And actually Sprint's 4G, 3G, whatever it is, the end of the cell phone service too. I've been here about 20 years. Before that, I lived in suburban St. Louis, born, raised upstate New York in Appalachia. And that's where some of my poetry really got its start, was up in those hills.
Do you send bonus cards beyond the 31 that you have to send?
Yes, I was involved in the 52 and 52, and that got a little tiring, honestly. But it was a whole year of poetry, which was pretty doggone good. And I enjoyed it. I put all the cards in a manila folder and all the artwork and everything, and probably can't see it. And then I go through, and I'm a little bit OCD and mentally retentive or detail oriented, however you want to say it. And I check names off, and sometimes I'll send just a poem that sort of strikes me to some of the participants that I've developed a relationship, a friendship, or at least an online relationship with those people. And I love some of the art. I get extra poems, so I give extra poems. I'm not a good artist, though. And I've pretty much run out of images that I can use for poetry, I think.
What are other things you love about POPO?
Well, for one, I think the deepening relationship between uh, different creative people, I would value that the most. Years ago, before we had social media, before there was a term for that, I participated in bulletin boards. And this was probably 96, 97, something like that. And people liked my creativity and I liked their technological savvy. So it was a symbiotic relationship. And I find that that happens. I'm thinking of, I don't know if I should mention any names here because I don't have permission to, but I'm thinking of some of the people like Ina and Colette and
Abia Tom?
Stanley and yeah, just bunches of people there um, that have triggered that creative urge in me. So I think it's much bigger than just writing a poem. I'm much more mindful of um, the incorporation of my life into every line, not maybe every image, but I mean, that's a goal. Um, another thing I like about it is that it, like I said, it starts the wheels rolling. Um, I don't teach at a college anymore, but I really like those 20 weeks a year off. That was nice. And I always get to September thinking that it's my favorite time of year and I can start over again. I have a new group of students to corrupt. And so August Popo is sort of like that too. I wonder who's on the list, you know, who's returning this year? Will I be on that same list? Will I go ahead and send extra poems to the people that I sent last year who aren't on my particular group? So it definitely works for me. Definitely works for me.
What would you change about POPO?
I would make me retired so I could do more of it. Sometimes I'll be in between clients at work and I'll say, I'm 2 days behind. I need to get with this. And so I take the 5 minutes between clients and do some writing right there on the computer. And you know, it may not be very good poetry for sure, but it keeps my mind looking at just how creative the universe is and how anybody with a creative streak at all needs to be a steward of that and move it in the right direction. Move it in the right direction. Whether it's about talking about ecology or politics or whatever you want to get involved in, you know. So what would I change? Boy, I don't know. I don't know that there's much I would change about it.
Are there any poetry communities online or in real life that you think might like to hear about the fest?
That would like to hear about the fest? Yeah, I am aware of a couple of folks doing some interesting uh, teaching of writing because of either the August Popo Fest or because of Andrea Balt's work, B-A-L-T, a young lady who came up with Write Yourself Alive as a self-help sort of situation where people write a lot of confessional first-person poetry and a lot of very bad poetry. But I don't think anything's bad poetry, but it's poetry I don't care for is that confessional stuff. But there's an online community that has matured out of that. And I did 1 month of Write Yourself Alive, and it's very costly to do a year's worth of that and things. And you know, it doesn't take a trip to Bali or Tahiti or Aruba or Scotland or Chile to change my environment to make me more creative. I know that some of those people know about August POPO because I posted on those bulletin boards and websites. And I've had some really good relationships, online relationships, never met these people, developed from those other groups. It's a formulaic type of writing, and it's a workbook, small piece of meditative, reflective, creative fire, tinder, if it were. And then you bring your experience to it in a very formulaic way, and things happen out of that. And I've utilized some of that with my work with other people. And I really, truly enjoy teaching composition and teaching exposition, and used to be, term paper, research paper, things like that. But I love expository writing. The amount of prose that I've put out compared to poetry over the years, probably there's a lot more prose.
What advice would you have for someone? What advice would you have for someone considering joining the fest?
Join, join, and be free to experiment with the form as I have, and be free to explore your own voice and the voice of the poetry. Because once you start that process, and I find painting to be like this, except I'm a horrible painter. When I turned 40, I took up oil painting, and that lasted very, very few months. And then I discovered acrylics probably when I turned 60. And I still can't paint. And actually, I don't care for it. But it's a medium that I'm amazed that what I paint shows some consistent picture, some consistent story. And I think the advice would be to write every day. And so I've taken that to the bank, Paul, and decided that I need to, if I'm a writer, I need to write every day. And the nice thing about being a person who is a wordsmith, and I don't know if I am or how well I am at that, is that the universe gets interpreted in a particular way. And I can start focusing on the good stuff rather than the bad stuff. So I think it's metamorphosizing, it changes people, It certainly did me. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Have you considered changing your middle name to Word?
No.
You'd be Daniel Wordsmith.
Yes, I would. Mm-hmm.
Do you have a postcard quote that you'd like to share with us?
You want a short one or a long one?
Whatever you want to read.
I know you're going to have to edit all those drinking cups out, but
I was drinking a little myself.
It helps, I am a coffee aficionado, and I really, really like coffee. I haven't had a drink of alcohol since 1987, so I have a little bit of creativity since then. But I try to source green beans from Vietnam and other places in the world, roast my own, brew my own coffee. And maybe that's why I have a sore throat. I'm not sure, is the coffee. I do have one I would like to read. It's from the very thing that started POPO Fest. And after I got my first 30, 45, 50 drafts out there, I wrote this about those poems. And it goes back to 2014. And it's actually a poem that is a preface to the book. And it says, about these poems, Spider Lace, Dragonfly Mind Sutra. And it goes like this. The bread lady's gonna tell me that she knows stones, as if there were meanings in the glossy oven of the August sky. The parched bake native postwoman chants softly, walking past the hyssop and dill. Always outside the fence, always every day. Small children everywhere dusty, scattered, and chased by the clouds across landscape. The old European gardener, now dead, a victim like no other technology. She wonder, will I sit with her for a while? Tell her about some clouds, storms gathering, her wispy thoughts traveling immortality in rippled sunset. The smell of dough and toasting seeds waft by, the wet earth scent of leaf matter in some sacred geometric planchette. Spells a name in hyacinth and dried oregano Ouija. Insect travels, brings night, writes hymns. This is the poem of the road's end, of shuffled gravel's softening, of a shallow lane, fallow's ending, and of the ocean beyond. So that was written in response, my own response to my own poetry. A little book that I owe entirely to you for urging me on, and the first effort at POPO. After I put it all together, I had a pretty good picture of what insects do in August, and the story that came out of that.
Far out, Daniel. Really sweet to engage you here for these few minutes. I'm very grateful for your inspired participation in the fest and your POPO evangelizing and your kind words. And also that poem that you wrote and dedicated in part to me was a really beautiful poem, and I'm grateful. I was a little stunned that someone could write something like that in connection with me. So thank you.
You're most welcome. I do believe that my poetry would not be where it's at today without the August POPO Fest. And I encourage other people that I run into who are, stuck, just can't get the page to come out of the typewriter, so to speak, to do exactly what you've taught us to do, which is to go with creativity, be spontaneous. And, if you need to revise it, you can always do that, but you can't always be spontaneous. So it's a discipline. I have a friend up in the Pacific Northwest close to you. He's an indigenous healer by the name of Woody Kipp, and he talks about spirituality. And he says, it's helpful to have some sort of a discipline in order to cultivate your spirituality. And I think it's helpful to have some sort of a discipline as a writer to cultivate the mind of poetry.
Freedom is a discipline we impose on ourselves, I think. Something like that, Marianne Moore.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you this morning. I really want to thank you for your attention to the process and the goals. And I think that I'm one of many, many people that thank you for all your efforts in making this happen. Someday when I come to the Midwest, from the Midwest to the far West, we'll share a cup of coffee.
We have some coffee here.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do.
Stay well, brother.
Seattle's, take care.
All right.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Dave.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.